This is Rick Malone for the San Francisco Symphony. Maurice Ravel loved children, and they loved him back. He was not a tall man, so maybe he felt more approachable to young people, but he also loved wind-up toys and fairy tales and making things for the children of his friends. Since early in his career, two of his closest friends had been Sipa and Ida Godebsky, who were at the center of a social circle that included Jean Cocteau, Serge Diaghilev, and Václav Nijinsky, and practically anyone who was anyone in the French music world, including composers like Roussel, Milhaud, Faya, Stravinsky, Satie, and Ravel. The Godebskys had two children, Mimi and Jean, and Ravel was almost as close to them as he was to their parents. Mimi recalled later that Ravel loved to tell them fairy tales, both traditional ones and some that he would make up just for them. One summer day in 1908, he arrived at their country house with a piece of music that he had written for them, based on some of those fairy tales. But this was not just a piece of music that he wrote for their enjoyment. This was a piece for them to play. As you might expect, the children of such artistically minded parents were subjected to music lessons, and even though they were far from virtuosos or prodigies, Ravel knew them well enough that he understood their capabilities, and he tailored both piano parts for their little hands. He even wanted them to play the premiere of the work at the very first concert of the prestigious Independent French Musical Society, which had been founded by Fauré. Unfortunately, Mimi was too frightened to play in public, so the premiere went to two other youngsters. The day after that performance, Ravel wrote a note to one of the players, who grew up to be one of the great interpreters of his music, Jean Leleu. Ravel wrote, "When you were a great virtuoso and I an old fogey, covered with honors or else completely forgotten, you will perhaps have pleasant memories of having given an artist the rare satisfaction of hearing a work of his of a rather unusual nature interpreted exactly as it should be. Thank you 1,000 times for your childlike and sensitive performance of Ma Mère Loire. Your devoted, etc., Maurice Ravel." For that first performance, Mother Goose consisted of 5 movements: the Pavane of the Sleeping Beauty, Tom Thumb, Laideronette, Empress of the Pagodas, Conversations of Beauty and the Beast, and The Enchanted Garden. All of the stories that inspired these pieces came from collections that were published in France in the 17th and 18th centuries, especially Charles-Perrault's Tales of Mother Goose, published in 1697. But Ravel's publisher Jacques Durand and the impresario Jacques Rouchet saw bigger possibilities. Durand persuaded the composer to orchestrate the set, and 2 years later, Rouchet convinced him to turn it into a full-length ballet, adding several new sections and some short connective interludes. A short prelude sets the scene with distant fanfares and bird calls. Clarinets ripple, the harp lets go with a magical glissando, and Ravel introduces many of the character themes that we'll hear later on. Scene 1, Dance of the Spinning Wheel, opens in an enchanted garden. Ravel describes the action like this. An old woman is seated at her spinning wheel. Princess Florine enters, jumping rope. She stumbles, falling against the spinning wheel, and is pricked by its spindle. The old woman calls for help. The young ladies and gentlemen in waiting rush in. They try in vain to revive the princess. Then they recall the curse of the fairies. Two ladies in waiting prepare the princess for her long sleep. In Scene 2, Pavane of the Sleeping Beauty, Florine is asleep. The old woman now stands erect, throws off her filthy cape, and appears in the sumptuous clothing and charming features of the good fairy, who entrusts her attendants with guarding the princess and granting her pleasant dreams. Scene 3, Conversations of Beauty and the Beast, takes its musical inspiration from Satie's 3 Gymnopédies for piano. In fact, Ravel presented Satie with a copy of the score, inscribed "For Eric Satie, grandpapa of Conversations of Beauty and the Beast and others. Affectionate homage from a disciple." End quote. Beauty enters, taking her mirror, and powders herself. The Beast's entrance may be the most famous orchestral solo for the lowest member of the woodwind section, the contrabassoon. Ravel writes, "With horror, Beauty rejects the declarations of the Beast, who falls at her feet sobbing. Reassured, Beauty makes fun of him coquettishly." The Beast falls down, faint with despair. Touched by his great love, Beauty raises him up again and gives him her hand. But, says Ravel, before her is a prince more handsome than Eros, who thanks her for having ended his enchantment. Another transition leads to Scene 4, Tom Thumb. A forest at nightfall. The woodcutter's 7 children enter. Tom Thumb crumbles a piece of bread. He looks about, but cannot find any houses. The children cry. Tom Thumb reassures them by showing the bread which he has strewn along their path. They lie down and fall asleep. Birds pass and eat all of the bread. Upon awakening, the children no longer find any crumbs, and they depart sadly, end quote, as the opening wandering melody returns. Another transitional interlude leads to Scene 5, Lady Renette, Empress of the Pagodas. The scene is a tent draped in Chinese style. Pagoda attendants enter and dance. Lady Renette appears with a green serpent crawling amorously at her side. Ravel loved the sort of exotic, oriental-sounding music that was popular at the time and spiced up this scene with pentatonic scales, jangling rhythms, and bell-like timbres. There's even a theme for the serpent. Bird calls lead us to scene 6, and we are back in the enchanted garden. It is dawn. Birds are singing. Prince Charming enters, led by a cupid. He notices the sleeping princess. She awakens at the same time that day breaks. All of the performers in the ballet group themselves around the prince and princess, who are united by Cupid. The good fairy appears and blesses the couple. And the garden bursts into bloom. Ravel had set himself an unusual challenge, finding new ways for an orchestra to create a musical fairyland out of piano pieces that were written for children to play, sometimes one note at a time. The composer and critic Roland Manuel wrote, "The Ravel of Mother Goose reveals to us the secret of his profound nature and shows us the soul of a child who has never left the kingdom of fairyland, who makes no distinction between nature and artifice, and who seems to believe that everything can be imagined and carried out on the material plane, provided everything is strictly controlled and regulated on the spiritual plane." End quote. This is Rick Malone for the San Francisco Symphony.